Hi everyone, I'm Kenneth Oravetz, and this is Critical Bibliographic and Artist Book Approaches to Understanding Comics Materiality. As Aaron Cashton notes in Between Pen and Pixel, in our digital era, it is more important than ever to pay attention to the material nature of the print codex and of print comics. While Cashton provides excellent insights into the intersection of print and digital comics, his argument that explorations of print comics formats emerge from a digital crisis trinity of encroachment is too narrow. I argue instead that contemporary material experimentation in comics may be seen as a continuation of a legacy of comics experimentation in search of new narrative and aesthetic possibilities for the book. This legacy and the bibliocentric, formally conscious leanings of many contemporary avant garde and alternative comics indicates that, rather than only digital frameworks, theoretical frameworks from critical bibliography and for artist books may also be useful for interpreting comics materiality. The significant crossover between artist books and comics can help us better understand each medium's material dynamics. Artist books take irrevocable advantage of the formal and material qualities and perceptions of the book to create art symbiotic with and experimenting with book formats. Both artist books and comics are invested in using such self conscious bookishness and perceptions of conventions to generate new meaning and experience. Both traditions consciously engage with how forms affect meaning and how audiences come to make meaning through engagement with reading conventions. This makes comics and artist books the forms par excellence for bibliographic study. Just as Amaranth Borsak declares that the artist book is an excellent format for teaching us about the changing nature of the book, I argue that comics points toward a future of the book. In connecting artist books and comics, I build on the work of media scholars attentive to format and interface, such as Joanna Drucker. Drucker has briefly commented upon similarities between artist books and comics, but here I will focus on her extensive discussion in the century of artist books. I will adapt theories from her and other scholars of artist books to apply to comics to explore their material potentials. Richard Kostellanitz's book art was one of the first scholarly oriented texts to explicitly analyze artist books. Kostelanitz argues that artist books envision what else the book might become through transcending conventions, an assertion that has only grown more popular in the digital era. Kostelanitz also briefly explicates some of artist books' unique reading dynamics. He writes that most books are read for information, either expository or dramatized. Book art books are made to communicate imaginative phenomena and thus create a different kind of reading experience. Freed from the demands of transparent delivery of textual information, artist books are more open to creating inventive aesthetic, sensory, narrative, and directly reactionary experiences for readers. Readers engage with artist books not only to extract meaning from them, but to have novel and provocative sensory engagements with them. Artist books therefore compel sensations as much as they may transmit information. Ulysses Carrion, a contemporary of Kostelanitz, was a key figure in the artist book scene in the 1970s. His 1975 The New Art of Making Books was a manifesto for the artist book community. Carrion provides a definition of sorts for the new art of artist books, an autonomous and self-sufficient form, including perhaps a text that emphasizes that form, a text that is an organic part of that form. Unlike transparent crystal goblet codices, a book industry norm since the 1930s, artist books emphasize their formal qualities, denaturalizing and deliberately synthesizing both contents and delivery methods. Carrion also explicates formal elements of the book that book artists should be aware of. A book is a sequence of spaces, he writes. Each of these spaces is perceived at a different moment. A book is also a sequence of moments. Sequencing is vital for and inextricable from the codex experience, and the spaces into which that sequence are divided can, to a degree, dictate the spatial and temporal moments within it. Carrion's usage of moment can refer to both time span and discrete event, in the sense that encountering a page is an event. In this sense, books are temporal mediums of progression, and artists can manipulate spaces within the book sequence to impact the reader's experience of temporality and encounter within. Spatial and sequential manipulation of this sort is a vital element of comics form. Panelization of comics can be interpreted as a material division of physical page space into individualized spaces that interlink in always constellatory and often linear sequences on the page. In a sense, panels serve as individual paginas contained in larger paginas. For critical bibliographer Bonnie Mack, a pagina is a unit of a paginated interface. A pagina is not necessarily a page split from its fellows, but rather a space divided from others within the mind of the reader and sometimes by the material design of the book. The pagina and physical page both influence meaning by the distinctive embodiment of the ideas they transmit. Comics, panels, rows, and other segments can be seen as paginas. Comics are similar in this way to scrolls, which were arranged in paginas, oftentimes columns of text, within one longer pagina, the paper of the scrolls itself. The reader could both read individual paginas within the sequence and view the larger whole, just as they can with comics panels. A notable difference, however, lies in how comics artists can play with the nested divisions. Many pagina panels are designed to be read both individually and as part of a larger whole by virtue of the image text nature of comics and the nesting nature of images. By part of a larger whole, I do not refer to how the reader integrates their experience of each pagina into a larger sense of narrative. Rather, I point to how a comics panel can serve both as a pagina of its own and as a mark that forms part of a focused and sometimes singular drawn sign, which is the focus of another larger pagina. In some cases, this is explicit, as in this page by Frank King. In comics, both the linear reading and an all-at-once reading are necessary to capture the full experience or narrative of the page. Even in cases where this sort of synthesis is not explicit or representative of a singular whole within the narrative, almost all multi-panel page print comics function in this manner. Panels and panel groups serve both as paginas and as components of larger signs, pages, and spreads. In this sense, comics both distort and rely on the pagina format. Comics artists may play with the junction and tension between the space of the full page and the space of the pagina panel to trouble the distinction between moments of reading. Those comics which make readers grapple with the space of reading in this way are akin to artist books in how they challenge readers to take a more thoughtful approach to their form and content. The comic spread functions as the largest pagina space. It plays a substantial role in parsing the moments of the codex. Regarding the page, Carrion states for book artists that in the new art, every page is different. Every page is an individualized element of a structure, the book, wherein it has a particular function to fulfill. Comics artists are often hyper-aware of the pagination of their codices, as when a reader opens a comic, they see not only one page, but the full spread. Thus, pages which might contain narrative revelations, or which graphically jar with preceding pages, or which need a full page spread to function, must carefully be distributed to both fulfill their function and to avoid interrupting other pages' functions. Each page and even pagina panel fulfills its particular function by engaging with the paginated flow of reading experience. Each page of the comic is an individualized element containing different marks from its fellows, corresponding to whatever effective, aesthetic, or narrative effect the artist seeks in that moment. Drucker declares that in every book, a decision has to be made about how to either emphasize, ignore, or overcome the fact that the openings are discrete units, separate space, each from the next, and yet part of a continuous whole. In comics, it is not that the discrete page units have to be emphasized, ignored, or overcome, but rather integrated precisely into the reading experience on the panel level. Sometimes page transitions may be emphasized to heighten a dramatic moment, but not always, and never should they be ignored. It is further impossible for a comic to overcome its paginated divisions, so set is a comic sequence on movement from one discrete unit of page space to another via panels. A transition from one page to another will always also be a transition between pagina panels. Material dynamics like style, panel sizing, framing, shape, and positioning on the page all play significant roles in dictating both the space and pace of this paginated reading experience. Astute comics artists utilize panelization and graphic design akin to book artists who, per Drucker, take advantage of the codex for all of its material properties and linguistic resonance. For comics, we can think of these properties and resonances as the communicative and extra-semantic dynamics of stylistic decisions and abstraction. Readers do not always interpret these stylistic decisions as much as they may feel them. In the case of more radical styles, deviant from readerly norms, the stylistic challenge the comic presents to the reader is again akin to the artist book. When a comics artist pays attention to these interlinked dynamics of space in the comics codex, with a book containing the page or spread and the page containing the panel composed of stylized marks, they're able to use a hierarchized system in unified fashion to generate expression and experience. In a multi-panel comic, it is not the images alone which express, but rather the materially ensconced juxtaposition of said images. A comic fails, or perhaps more accurately creates ergodic friction in Espen Arseth's sense, when the juxtaposition fails. Drucker notes that Roland Barthes described the ways in which language can anchor meaning in an image or else help serve a relay function to put the image into relation with other elements in a complex structure. Without language to serve these delimiting functions, he emphasizes, the image floats, a site for many possible interpretations. Comics, especially wordless ones, engage in a unique dynamic in which images almost always act instead of Barthes' language to delimit the interpretations of juxtaposed images. However, there is always some room for floating, or interpretive ambiguity. Some comics artists engage consciously in this resistance to interpretation in comics form, through means like abstraction and non sequitur, generating ergodic and meta experiences for readers. It is akin to another of Carrion's claims. In a book of the new art, words don't transmit any intention. They're used to form a text which is an element of a book, and it is this book as a totality that transmits the author's intention. If one were to posit the new art of comic books, one would state that new art comics are those which are consciously unified into the totality of the book. To quote media scholar Dick Higgins, a new art comic doesn't contain a lot of works like a book of poems, it is a work. In this sense, it is also true for comics readers that, to read a comic successfully and richly, one must apprehend the book as a structure, identifying its elements and understanding their function, as Carrion states in regards to artist books. It is merely that comics readers are often not wholly aware they are doing so, so subsumed is comics reading in the cultural subconscious. Comics in the avant-garde and alternative traditions often disrupt this subconsciousness by manipulating conventions of the codex comic. In this disruption or interruption, these comics both foreground prior conventions and communicate imaginative phenomena in Kostolanitz's sense via new ways of reading comics. They may not just violate narrative or expository conventions, but often also the potential for cogent or even existent narrative or exposition within the codex. They are not only interfaces for the communication of ideas, but also interfaces for sensory experience. These comics, resistant to normative modes of uptake, push the reader toward aesthetic experiences that are perhaps not reading at all, but rather a viewing that delights in the imaginative creation on the page, rather than seeking informative uptake from it. The codex form of these comics creates a sequentiality, and the visual allusions to comics conventions create a structure, but the sequence may be a sequence of experiences for the reader, rather than a narrative progression. All comics, with their reliance on drawn modes of expression that are, at least at the book's outset, wholly original, i.e., not replicated directly from forms in the cultural subconscious like languages, contain this sensory pleasure to some degree. The reader must first have a sensory experience before decoding the pagina. But this is amplified in those comics whose dynamics strongly diverge from convention and or direct semiotic iconography. Oftentimes, these comics, like Drucker's artist books, show a margin, gutter, page, or frame to be both the thing that it is and also show an awareness of the features that form the identity of that element. Their rupture from convention and investment in style both provides an aesthetic experience of sensation, and once that experience has been processed into representation or the lack thereof, an exploration of what comics conventions like the panel, drawing, and gutter can be and do. But again, I should emphasize that it is not only these more avant-garde and experimental comics that are invested in material dynamics of comics. The page space and style of many comics can be read in the manner I have described. These are just a few examples of how comics strongly align with artist books and can be productively read through theoretical frameworks in that field. Knowing this, we may now use certain artist book frameworks to close read comics texts and to shed additional light on established comics reading methodologies. Looking at comics that pointedly engage with these material and artist book dynamics will often mean drawing scholarly attention to underappreciated avant-garde work. In addition, asserting that comics can function similarly to artist books with all the self-conscious and inextricable material attention to the codex of the latter shows the vitality and value of the codex format today. Indeed, one might say that comics fulfill the democratic process of the promise of the artist book today. The alterity of avant-garde comics distances them enough from typical codices to emphasize the codex's unique dynamics, its distinct pagination, sizing, and production material, but this occurs in many mainstream comics as well. Print comics, in large part by virtue of their spatial arrangement, regularly use the codex form in a sharply aware fashion to generate experiences and meanings that would be impossible in other formats. In doing so, they reveal the value of the print book in the digital age and suggest that the future of print may lie in creating similarly inextricably codex texts. Thank you.